Outcasts among the stars, they never said it outright, but you didn't need to be telepathic to know what the others thought of the Heek. Their polished diplomatic language, their carefully filtered messages, their trade agreements bound with clauses, thicker than armoring plates, all of it reeked of one thing: avoidance. The Heek were tolerated but not embraced, accepted but not welcomed. They weren't violent, weren't criminals. They didn't invade, didn't colonize, didn't manipulate trade routes. They simply existed, and that was the problem. To the wider galactic community, silicon-based life was unnatural, an error in the biological equation. Intelligent, yes. Useful, certainly, but unnatural. They called it behind closed doors. Glass flesh, a derogatory term, a quiet insult, a silent war. The Heek didn't flinch from it. They were used to surviving in radiation-heavy wastelands and liquid methane lakes. They didn't need kindness, just oxygen-sealed trade corridors and enough power to run their forges. Their legacy, however, was undeniable. Over the last 8 centuries, no race had produced better deep space engines. Their drives were compact, efficient, and adaptable. The only reason half the species in the known sectors weren't crawling through voids at sublight was because of the Heek, and yet, every deal was sealed with reluctance. No embassies invited them. No alliances signed with them. No planets opened to them. Until humanity. The Heek remembered the first human ship. It arrived limping into one of their deep space maintenance yards, a retrofitted colonial hauler with scorched plates and a failing reactor. The humans were loud, blunt, crude by some standards, and curious to a fault. They didn't flinch at the sight of translucent skin or crystal-threaded organs. They didn't shy away from the humidity the Heek needed. In fact, the captain said, "Smells like a sauna and a battery charger had a baby in here. I love it." That was unexpected. The translator glitched. The Heek technician, Rockin 37, had tilted his head slightly, unsure if baby charger was a threat, but the human laughed. Laughed so hard the crew joined in. It wasn't mockery, it was joy. They shook hands, traded stories, drank something that nearly burned a hole in the Heek's filtration unit. And when the engine was finally restored, the human slapped the Heek on the shoulder and said, "Next time, we're bringing your people to Earth. You haven't lived until you've eaten a mango." Rorken had no idea what a mango was, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks passed. Then more ships came. They weren't in need of repair, not always. Sometimes they brought gifts, music encoded in binary, samples of Earth's soil, holograms of something called stand-up comedy. One even brought a dog, which terrified half the Heek until it fell asleep upside down snoring. Humanity was strange, but strange in a way that didn't push the Heek away. Instead, they pulled them closer. Rorken had spent most of his life watching the galaxy move around him like a visitor in someone else's home. Always polite, always outside the circle, but the humans were different. They didn't have circles, they had fires. And when they built one, they made sure everyone had a place near it. He remembered the first time the humans used the word "it" was during a repair session with a scout frigate from Earth's 4th Fleet. One of the humans stared at the Heek's crystalline spinal fins, glowing faintly in the dim light, and muttered something. Rorken blinked. "What does that word mean?" The crew laughed. "It's a compliment," one said. "It means you're badass." There wasn't a word in Heek lexicon that matched it, but something about the tone made Rorken's limbs warm. They began calling them dragons, not in fear, in reverence. The Heek, long called monsters, found themselves being recast as legends. But it didn't end there. A few months later, a formal delegation from Earth requested a private audience at Heek Yard Prime, not for repairs, not for trade, but for a proposition. They were offering a planet, not on loan, not rented, given, uninhabitable for us, the ambassador said, but potentially perfect for your kind. High pressure, dense atmosphere, heat levels only your people could love. We call it Venus. What do you think? Rorken had frozen. His mouth made a clicking sound that, translated, meant, "Is this a test?" The ambassador smiled. "No, it's a new start." The news shattered the galactic community. The Heek, the outcasts, were being offered a world by the newest, least politically obedient species in the galaxy. The old powers mocked it at first, called it a stunt, but when negotiations turned into infrastructure and settlements bloomed across the hellish surface of Venus, the tone changed. Now, ships bearing both Heek and Terran flags flew together. They traded, researched, built. The galaxy didn't laugh anymore, but Rorken remembered when they did. He remembered how every system ignored their offers, how every request for cooperation had been met with a closed door. And now, the ones who once sneered found themselves depending on Heek drives. retrofitted by human ingenuity and backed by dual-species patent law. The universe had changed, and all it took was one partnership, one hand offered, not out of pity but respect. When sparks crossed stars, there had never been a line in the sand not officially. The galactic community didn't bother with declarations. When it came to the Heek, they didn't need to. It was understood, unspoken, the kind of prejudice built, not from hatred, but indifference. And indifference, Rockin 37 had learned, was colder than any war ever waged. They didn't block Heek trade. They didn't fire on their ships. But they didn't talk to them either. They didn't invite them to summits, didn't include them in diplomatic frameworks or cross-cultural coalitions. Every system had its own excuse, always polished and palatable, incompatible biology, dangerous reactor emissions, unpredictable crystal harmonics. There was always a reason. The humans never asked for one. Instead, they asked, "Do you want to grab lunch?" It started on Venus. Not long after the first colony dome was raised, a minor human research team had arrived with the intention of analyzing Heek metallurgy for high-pressure engine applications. Most of the Heek assumed the humans would stay inside their suits, take their notes, and leave. But they didn't. One of them, an engineer named Harlow, stepped out of the mobile lab wearing a pressure-hardened exo-rig, his helmet fogged from the heat. He walked up to Rockin, casually waving a sealed lunchbox in the air. "Hope you don't mind," he said. I brought to Rockin didn't understand at first. To Klimos. Figured we might work through midday. It was a tiny gesture, a trivial, forgettable moment for most species, but not for the Heek. They had been conditioned to expect boundaries, expect distance. Even curiosity from other species came packaged in sterile observation domes and layers of academic detachment. But this was shared space. That the two sat beneath a central cooling tower as lava vapor hissed in the distance. Rockin's body steamed in the nitrogen-thick air. Harlow munched on a compressed nutrient bar and offered another one up, saying, "It's mostly synthetic protein. Smells like burnt rubber but tastes like optimism." Rockin had no mouth, but he understood the gesture, and he remembered from that point on, human research crews arrived more frequently. Not just engineers, biologists, linguists, historians. Some came to learn, some came to trade, some came simply to be there. They marveled at Heek, crystal work, the way their forges used harmonics instead of pressure to shape alloys. They sketched diagrams, asked questions, took notes, offered theories. Rockin's forge hadn't been so noisy in a generation. The most surprising part, the humans brought children. It was unheard of. Other species wouldn't even bring their elders within visual range of a Heek station. But the Terrans strolled in, younglings in tow, eyes wide, voices louder than any acceptable diplomatic protocol. One child, maybe 7 Earth years old, saw Rockin polishing a thermal coupler and said, "You look like a robot made of diamonds." Rockin, not knowing what to say, replied simply, "Thank you." That child's mother gave him a hug for being polite to the shiny gentleman, and for the first time in his long life, Rockin felt seen, not analyzed, not tolerated, but seen. Still, the galaxy whispered. As human-Heek cooperation grew, other civilizations responded. Some cut trade ties, others raised tariffs. The Mah called it a reckless deviation. The Thulux issued a formal statement warning that integration with unstable environmental species risks contaminating interstellar standards. The humans answered with a shrug. "We do things our way," their ambassador said at the Council of Greater Systems. "Always have, always will." When the protests rose, humanity didn't backpedal. They opened more research corridors, expanded. The Venusian Dome Network offered joint scholarships in xenophysics. Every push against the Alliance was met not with retreat, but growth. And then came the real test. A rogue freighter, the Callow Vex, suffered a critical FTL malfunction while crossing near the human-Heek trade corridor. Its power core detonated mid-drift, spilling exotic matter into the sector and rupturing a planetary orbit near the ZNR system. None of the core species responded. The Heek did. They sent 3 emergency cruisers into the field, operating under high radiation exposure for 72 hours to contain the breach and stabilize orbital decay. When the magnetic clamps failed, human salvage tugs arrived, chaining their hulls together to reinforce the failing containment grid. They worked in unison, human hands, Heek minds. No payment requested, no diplomatic negotiations, just action. By the time ZNR officials arrived, the disaster had been averted. The footage went viral across the core world's grainy camera drones, showing Heek engineers holding volatile drives steady with raw gravitational compression fields. while human engineers rerouted plasma heat through old asteroid tunnels. That it changed things, not overnight, but undeniably suddenly. The word alliance didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a model still. It wasn't until Rocken heard the word again that he truly understood. He was giving a lecture, his first ever, at a joint orbital university near Saturn's rings. Nervous, uncertain, still unused to crowds. Afterward, a student approached. Human, young, he smiled, extending a hand. "You're the reason I chose xenomechanics," he said. "People used to call you monsters, now they call you dragons." Rocken blinked. Dragons. Ancient Earth legends. Guardians. Beasts of fire and wisdom. Beautiful. Fearsome. Respected. Rocken nodded slowly. His body hummed faintly. Natural reaction to high emotion. He had spent his entire life being seen as less. Now, he was a symbol not of terror, but of possibility. The planet they called Impossible Venus had always been a joke to the rest of the galaxy. To the Maharat, it was a chemical wasteland thick with acid clouds, blistering heat, and a pressure so crushing it made most life forms dizzy just looking. At the telemetry, to the Ranu, it was a punchline in engineering lectures. "Try terraforming Venus," they'd say. "It's like trying to cook soup with a flamethrower in a sealed room." But to the Heek, it was potential. And to the humans, it was a challenge. The first joint landing happened in the third Terran year of the Alliance. A small shuttle, half human-built, half Hike modified, descended into the upper atmosphere like a bird diving into a storm. Rocken 37 was aboard, along with 4 human scientists and a drone array designed to monitor surface tolerances. When they landed, no one said a word for several seconds, not because of awe, because of laughter. The shuttle's external sensors fogged instantly. The doors hissed and flexed as atmospheric pressure tested their integrity. The temperature inside rose steadily, despite triple insulation. One of the humans, drenched in sweat, shouted, "Feels like a toaster fell in love with a volcano." Even Rocken chuckled, his dermal plates vibrating gently with amusement. But beneath the heat, beneath the choking clouds and metallic sky, there was something real. The surface was stable. The mineral composition was nearly ideal for Heekbar, and with the right adjustments, climate regulators, nitrogen enhancers, pressure-hardened algae, it could work. What had been a cosmic punchline was now a blueprint for a new beginning. Construction began within 6 months. The Heek built wide spires wrapped in crystal mesh to harvest and stabilize atmospheric energy. Humans established mobile laboratories, rolled out with 6-legged drones and bulletproof tents. The two species coordinated shifts, learning each other's rhythm, each other's quirks. The Heek learned that humans required an impossible amount of coffee. The humans learned that Heek engineers worked in total silence, often communicating entire instructions through low-frequency vibrations. Progress was slow. Venus was unforgiving, but they didn't stop. And then came the first night. It wasn't truly night on Venus, not in the way most species understood it. The planet rotated so slowly that a single day lasted longer than an Earth month. But even in that endless twilight, there was a moment of rest, a moment when the solar glare softened, the clouds thinned, and the world grew quiet. That night, a group of humans and Heek sat beneath the cooling towers, passing around a thermally sealed food capsule and stories from their homeworlds. One human told the tale of Earth's deep oceans, how light vanished at certain depths, and creatures glowed from within to survive the dark. A Heek engineer named Talvek responded by humming a song, not in words, but through resonance. The sound echoed across the steel, deep and pure. The humans fell silent. "What was that?" one whispered. "A morning song," Talvek said. "We used to sing it when a forge collapsed, or when someone went missing in the storms." No one spoke for a long time. That was the night they stopped being an experiment. That was the night they became partners. Within a year, the atmosphere had stabilized enough for basic terraforming. Venus wasn't pleasant, but it was survivable with the right suits and shelters. The Heek built vertically, shaping towers that pierced the mist like obsidian needles. Humans carved out underground labs and energy bunkers, often naming them after obscure cultural icons: Station Bowie, Camp Ripley, Base New York. As the colonies expanded, something unexpected happened. The humans didn't ask for payment. They didn't draw up binding contracts or ownership claims. Instead, they said, "You can have it. We'll help you deserve somewhere to call home." Rocken had spent his life watching governments dodge the question of Heek settlement rights. They were useful everywhere, welcome nowhere. Even the species that depended on their engines never offered land. But here, on this scorching, sulfur-drenched planet, they were planting flags, not under protest, under hope. And the galaxy, noticed the Thulak government issued a warning to human command, accusing them of destabilizing interspecies norms. The Maharat proposed trade sanctions. The Golly Syndicate hinted that Venus might violate galactic environmental clauses. Humanity's response was a single word: noted. Then they sent more support ships. Human volunteers arrived by the dozens: engineers, terraformers, medical officers. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of stubborn defiance. But more and more came simply because they believed in what was being built. The Heek offered something in return: knowledge. They began teaching humans how to shape crystal harmonics, how to construct self-repairing holes, how to compress power into molecular lattice. Together they built hybrid systems engines, stronger than any single race could produce alone. And still more ships came. One day a diplomat from the council arrived, hoping to document what was happening. When he stepped off the shuttle and saw the Heek and humans laughing over a broken fusion coil, hands slick with oil, faces blistered with heat, he looked confused. "This wasn't supposed to work," he said quietly. "You were never meant to connect." Rocken turned to him, the first to speak. "Perhaps that's the point," he said. "The galaxy never gave us a place, but humanity gave us a chance." The diplomat returned to the stars, but the message traveled farther than he did. It spread across channels and relays. It reached border colonies and fringe science stations, and across the galaxy, species who had watched the Heek from afar began to question everything they thought they knew. Maybe monsters weren't always monsters. Maybe the galaxy had been laughing too soon. The alliance, they couldn't stop the galaxy, had always run on fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the unstable, fear of change. For centuries, the Heek had been tolerated but never embraced. Their technology was valuable, but their presence was considered inconvenient. Every attempt they made to settle, to integrate, was quietly dismantled through laws, loopholes, and subtle threats. But then the humans arrived and fear stopped working. The humans were different, reckless, perhaps, unpredictable, certainly, but they weren't afraid. Not of the Heek, not of planetary risk, and definitely not of angering the so-called Council of Galactic Stability. That made them dangerous in a way the galaxy hadn't seen before. And so the pressure began. At first it came through diplomatic whispers. An emissary from the Gali hinted that perhaps humans should reconsider their involvement. The Maharat issued a formal request to re-evaluate human Heek trade. The Thulak deployed media campaigns, painting the Venus project as unstable and unsafe. The humans, they published all their safety data online. Every reading, every simulation, every hard-earned lesson from days spent choking on sulfur or freezing in near-vacuum storms. Then the blockades started. The Ranyu began detaining human vessels near their borders. Trade licenses were lost in bureaucracy. Supplies to Venus went missing in transit. A Heek freighter was outright denied access to an oxygen refinery it had co-funded. But humans had learned to live in chaos, and they had learned fast. When fuel shipments were blocked, they rerouted through asteroid belts. When food supply chains were disrupted, they bioengineered heat-resistant crops and started growing them in pressurized domes. Venus wasn't beautiful yet, but it was feeding itself. The turning point came during the Great Assembly on New Galaxy's Prime. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in one of the galaxy's oldest neutral stations, its halls echoing with centuries of cautious negotiation and controlled progress. The topic: the Human-Heek Alliance and the future of interstellar cohesion. Humans were given 5 minutes to speak. The representative chosen was Admiral Elena Vaughn, a former Deep Space Fleet commander turned diplomat. She didn't wear a robe or ceremonial armor. She showed up in a pressure suit, still dust-stained from her most recent trip to Venus. When she stood before the assembly, she said nothing at first. She just held up a small, palm-sized object. A crystal core glowed with internal energy, one of the new hybrid drives, the result of Heek-human cooperation. It was small, elegant, powerful, and utterly silent. "This," she said softly, "is what fear tried to stop." She placed it on the table. "This is what unity builds when you stop listening to old fears." The hall fell quiet. "You say, we've broken tradition," she continued. "You're right, we did. We chose not to fear, and in doing so, we found friends. Not monsters, not weapons, just people who'd been denied a place for far too long." Whispers broke out. Vaughn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've called us reckless, unruly, uncivilized. Maybe we are, but we know injustice when we see it, and we don't look the other way." With that, she left. The speech didn't win hearts overnight, but it started something. especially when every member of the HEEC delegation once denied entry into most of those chambers stood silently at the back of the hall, listening. That image spread faster than any speech ever could. Across the networks, in quiet cafes and dusty ports, in student forums and engineer bunkers, people began asking the same question: why were the HEEC really kept out? The answer became clearer every day, because no one wanted to admit what they were capable of. Back on Venus, that capability exploded. With human data optimization and HEEC construction mastery, they launched the first atmospheric phase shift, a rare, massive stabilizer that finally brought temperate zones into viability. Lakes formed, rain fell for the first time in centuries, and as the acid thinned and the pressure dropped, something even more miraculous occurred. The HEEC began to fly their wings. Long-thought evolutionary remnants had never worked on their homeworld. Gravity and atmosphere made flight impossible, but here, on Venus with its thick, stable air, they soared, clumsy at first, then gracefully. Children hovered above crystalline rooftops, laughing as they dipped through silver clouds. Elders glided between buildings, singing resonance hymns to mark milestones. The first flight festival on Venus was broadcast across hundreds of channels. Viewers wept watching a species long grounded finally touch the sky, and humanity was right beside them, filming, cheering, celebrating. As cooperation deepened, so did trust. Joint academies were built, places where humans and HEEC taught each other their specialties. The humans excelled at improvisation, creative problem-solving, and emotional intuition. The HEEC brought unparalleled precision, patience, and harmonic engineering no AI had ever replicated. Together, they didn't just build, they invented power. Grids that could sing diagnostics, medical chambers that used crystal resonance instead of invasive tools, navigation systems that read spatial vibrations through space-time itself. They were making things that had never existed, tools that redefined the limits of what was possible, and the other species watched. Some grew nervous, others grew envious. A few began to quietly offer trade deals, partnerships, even apologies. The tide was turning, but not everyone would accept it. As the alliance grew, so did resistance. Old powers don't surrender easily, especially not to those they once laughed at. But this time, neither the humans nor the HEEC were laughing. They were preparing, together. When the sky trembled, Venus was transforming not just into a colony, but into a symbol of unity no one had expected. A place where two species that had once been dismissed were now building something others feared, and secretly admired. But progress never moves in straight lines. The Maharat Empire, long considered the unofficial enforcers of galactic tradition, had been watching. Their pride had already taken a hit when human ships started outpacing theirs. But when HEEC technology entered the mix and made it look effortless, the insult became too sharp to ignore. The final spark came when the Maharat ambassador demanded to inspect the Venus settlement, claiming environmental violations. They weren't looking for violations, they were looking for excuses. The inspection team arrived with twice the standard escort. Military vessels, not scientific ships. They came not with questions but with quiet weapons charged, just in case. The HEEC greeted them with cautious respect. The humans greeted them with cameras broadcasting every moment live across thousands of networks. They didn't want a conflict, but if it happened, everyone would see who fired first. The Maharat team stayed for 6 days. They found nothing wrong. No illegal tech, no dangerous practices. Just innovation, collaboration, harmony. And that terrified them, because deep down, the Maharat knew what it meant. The old order was crumbling. The moment their ships left orbit, the rumors began, unconfirmed. Maharat fleet movements, new weapons tested near neutral zones, whispers of preventative action. In secret chambers beneath Venus's first capital, humans and HEEC met in urgent councils, not to declare war but to prepare for one. "We are not alone," said Ravina, a young HEEC strategist whose ancestors had once been forced to hide their wings. "But we are not yet safe." Her words lit something in the room. It wasn't fear, it was focus. Human engineers began modifying their most advanced suits not for exploration, but for defense. They merged reactive carbon polymer with HEEC resonance armor, creating battlesuits that could withstand both plasma fire and energy distortions. HEEC architects reinforced Venusian cities with seismic dampeners and phase barrier nodes. Hidden beneath crystal gardens, they weren't just building homes, they were building strongholds. And still, they hoped it wouldn't come to violence, but fate had a different idea. Exactly 12 days after the Maharat fleet left Venus, the Tyrusus incident happened. Tyrosus was a civilian human vessel, unarmed, slow, filled with hydroponic engineers. Returning from Saturn's rings, it had no value, no strategic worth, which is why its destruction shocked the galaxy. Every life on board was lost. The ship torn apart by an energy pulse signature, unmistakably Maharat. They claimed it was a rogue test, a misfire, but no one believed them, and humanity didn't wait. They didn't scream or beg or fire blindly into space. They sent a message, a single broadcast, just 5 words. We remember how you laughed. Then silence. For 20 hours, then the humans moved. With permission from the Heek, they launched Operation Aegis Dawn. Not a counterattack, not revenge, a shield, a fleet of hybrid ships Heek built, human-designed rose from Venus's upper atmosphere, not to fire, but to protect. They parked themselves at the edge of neutral space. They activated the new FTL buffers that could protect planets from near-jump trauma. They deployed drones that mapped every inch of space around Mahara territory, and they waited. It was a move born not of fear, but of strength. The message was clear: we are not prey anymore. The galaxy held its breath, and strangely, so did the Maharat. For the first time in generations, they did not escalate. Because they realized something far more frightening than weapons or fleets. The humans weren't fighting alone, and the Heek were no longer ignored. For the first time, 2 outcast species had done the impossible. They had changed the rules. Back on Venus, life continued. Buildings rose, children flew, and in underground labs, quiet revolutions continued. Cleaner engines, stronger medicine, faster drives. But for Ravina, for Admiral Vaughn, and for the millions who had watched the Tyruses burn, the peace was fragile, and they would never let it break again. Because when the sky trembled, they stood together, and the stars had taken notice. Beneath the surface, beyond the stars, the silence after the Tyruses tragedy wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. But the storm didn't arrive with plasma fire or shattered hulls. It arrived in whispers, sabotage, and spies. On Venus, the new alliance had become more than just practical. It was symbolic, and symbols make powerful targets. A shipment of medical nanites vanished en route to a research dome. 2 of the Venus orbital satellites went offline within hours of each other, both due to unexpected solar interference. And then came the assassination attempt. It wasn't dramatic, just a single glass of water meant for a visiting human envoy, quietly laced with a slow-acting neurotoxin. The only reason it failed was because Heek biology couldn't tolerate the glass compound it had been stored in. The water had etched the inner surface, leaving behind a smell so bitter it made the envoy gag. Before taking a sip, an investigation followed. Quiet, focused, ruthless. They found the perpetrator, not Maharat, not Tychon, but a hired proxy from a neutral species the Saridi bought with promises of forgotten tech and off-world privileges. The message was clear. The old empires weren't going to fire first. They were going to erode the alliance from the inside. But the Heek were no longer naive, and humanity had centuries of experience with dirty politics. In response, the alliance launched Project Veilbreaker, a covert task force made up of the best from both worlds. Heek infiltrators who could change the density of their flesh to slip through nearly any barrier, and humans who could read emotion from a twitch of the eye. Together, they began dismantling the web. They didn't just expose spies, they exposed networks, funding trails, secret communications between ancient powers too afraid to act openly. And when the proof went public, it didn't create chaos, it created choice. Species that had long kept their heads down began to ask hard questions. Why were we told the Heek were dangerous? Why are humans treated like children in a grown-up galaxy? And why are these 2 undesirables achieving more in 20 years than we have in 200? Some of the answers were ugly, some were shameful, but the truth had a strange side effect that gave others hope. The Usari, long considered mute wanderers of the Edge systems, offered access to their resonance cores. The Vothan, known for their silence in trade, offered maps and charted clusters and ancient ruins once sealed by treaty. Slowly, the alliance grew. Not with treaties and handshakes, but with shared dreams and shared enemies. Meanwhile, Venus became more than just a colony. It became a capital, its core now pulsed with a tri-species research center, one that cracked the code on atmospheric resonance drives, making near-light travel available at a fraction of the power cost. Its skies buzzed with new class freighters, their designs half Heek curve and half human angle, but not everyone was ready to celebrate. Admiral Vaughn, the Heek fleet commander, paced in the central control spire overlooking Venus's equatorial belt. The starscape seemed peaceful, but Van had lived too long to believe in appearances. "We are winning," he said quietly to his second, a young human tactician named Rena Lau, "and that's often when the enemy grows desperate." Lau nodded. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." And just then confirmation. The relay flashed red dot an encoded transmission from a patrol on the edge of the Maharat border. Unidentified fleet movements. Not near Venus, but heading toward the Asari worlds. It wasn't an invasion yet, but it was a test. A probe to see if the Alliance would defend someone who wasn't one of their own. Vaughn didn't hesitate. Dispatch the Ellerin-class cruisers. No weapons active, just presence. Rena stared. "You think they'll back down?" "No," he replied. "But they'll think twice about escalation when our ships are parked in orbit. With full environmental shields running, what if they fire anyway?" Vaughn looked out the viewport. His wings, normally tucked tightly, slowly spread, absorbing the ambient heat and glowing with faint bioluminescence. "Then we make history." The fire and the future. The Ellerin-class cruisers arrived in Asari space within 40 standard hours. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't need to. The shimmering hulls, half organic and half forged in Earth's lunar foundries, hovered in low orbit over the forested moon of Estelle. Each ship broadcasted a simple signal: "We're here, and we're watching." The Maharat ships, 15 in number, halted at the edge of the system. They floated in tense silence for hours, and then, one by one, they turned around. The message was received, loud and clear. But everyone knew this wasn't the end. This was the turning point. Back on Venus, an emergency summit convened, not out of panic but purpose. Representatives from 12 species gathered beneath the domed spires of the Central Accord Hall, where nitrogen-rich air and pressure flux chambers allowed all delegates to breathe comfortably in the same room. At the head of the long obsidian table stood two figures, one human, one Heek, Commander Alara Trent, known across Allied space for leading the orbital rescue of the Silverdrift colony. Nkethre, the first Heek diplomat ever awarded the Human Star of Merit. Ilara's voice carried strength. "We were mocked, ignored, lied to, but we didn't answer with war. We answered with innovation, with curiosity, and with open hands." Kethri followed, voice humming with deep resonance. "When we stood alone, we were dismissed. But together, we are undeniable." It wasn't just talked out. In the past 8 years, joint human-Heek terraforming had yielded 3 habitable worlds. Interstellar travel time had dropped by half. The Alliance held patents for 97 breakthrough technologies, and 80% of new scientific publications bore at least one Heek or human co-author. Still, not all victories were loud. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, old powers plotted. They couldn't stop progress, but they could stall it. They could make it bleed, so the Alliance moved first. They didn't launch a war fleet, they launched a Horizon project, a massive ring of research stations orbiting a dead sun. Once a monument to failure, now a beacon for the future. Inside, the best minds from over 20 species worked to develop the first fully conscious artificial navigational entity, a living intelligence capable of traversing deep gravity wells without distortion, a mind that could plot routes through folded space with instinct. They named it Unity, not a weapon, not a tool, a symbol. When it came online, the shock was universal. Not because it worked, but because its first spoken words were, "I dream of stars I've never seen. Can I go?" The Alliance said yes. Unity launched aboard the Aurora Dawn, the most advanced ship ever built, its hull grown in Heek gardens and armored with Earth's Graph-Inkavlar hybrid weave. Its maiden voyage would be to a system beyond any known chart, a voyage into the dark. As the ship rose from Venus's launch bay, crowds gathered across both worlds, human, Heek, and those who had once doubted them. And in that silence, as the Aurora Dawn vanished in a shimmer of light, something shifted across the galaxy. It wasn't just AW, it was possibility. A Maharat transmission intercepted days later confirmed it. They weren't preparing to strike. They were preparing to copy, to imitate, to catch up. Because at last, the universe understood. The Alliance wasn't a joke. It was a blueprint of resilience, of balance, of species who had been scorned, misunderstood, or underestimated, until they found each other. Decades passed. The term Alliance faded. It became something more. A union. One not bound by blood or biology, but by choice. New generations were born not knowing what it meant to live without the other. Heek children were raised reading human fairy tales. Human children studied Heek mineral resonance to grow their first AI companions. And in classrooms, one lesson was universal. Unity doesn't begin with strength. It begins with someone laughing at you and you choosing to rise anyway. The galaxy would never be the same. But then again, it never was. Not after they teamed up with humans.